Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked Podcast. So, what we do here is we try to dig into the data behind a lot of internet arguments and see what's really going on. So, we are semi affiliated with B. McGraw's website.
Says the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or jabd.com.
And today we're going to talk about whether we are worse off than we have been in the past. You see a lot of doomerism on Reddit and Twitter and other online websites. So the question is, are we actually in a worse situation than we were, however many years ago? The exact past is undefined. Is it the 1950s?
Spoiler alert, it depends.
Yeah. So, all right. So I think this is something I see a lot online.
I see it all the time. I just joined the this way of thinking subreddit called r/Optimist Unite. It's pretty good.
So like I was saying, the sort of three negative emotions you see online. One is basically outrage, two is cynicism, and three is doomerism. So you see a lot of just constant anger at different things happening, constantly questioning people's motives, and just people complaining about how like society's getting destroyed or whatever. Typically, it's people who their own lives kind of suck, who kind of talk about how bad society is, and in my opinion, a lot of times they're just kind of projecting their own feelings onto the rest of the world.
We can get into those reasons afterwards, I think, because I have some
of
my own for why people think this way.
So there's a couple books that I think are relevant here. So Robert Putnam is I think he's a social scientist, but he wrote several books, but two of them. So one is Bowling Alone, which came out I think in 2000, and it was a book about America's fraying social bonds. And then he wrote another book in 2020 called The Upswing, which took a longer term view of society. And basically in that book, he's saying, well, in many ways we had better social bonds in the 1950s, but if you go back even further, things in many ways were worse off in, for example, the late 1800s. And then there's also a book I've referenced before called Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker that kind of talks about how in many ways society is much better off now than it has been before. It really kind of depends. Essentially the way we're going to approach this is start with all the ways in which we're better off, and then the sort of more mixed or nuanced positions, and then all the ways in which we are worse off. It kind of depends on how you approach the topic, on whether or not things are better or worse off now than they were in the past, and which of those things you consider more important, and also how far back in time you go, because
it totally depends on your values. Like, if for some reason you wanted to objectify whether or not we're better off or worse off by compute power, we're always going to be getting better, or number of things that you can watch on Netflix, or I don't know. There's a lot of silly ways you could do it, potentially.
So first, we'll start with the sort of ways in which we're better off. So first is civil strife, which is kind of a broad term. But the first part is crime. Are we better or worse off? We already did an entire episode. So it was episodes 8 and 9. We basically talked about crime. And we're not going to rehash everything, but the overall point is crime is basically at all-time lows right now. So in terms of crime, we're much better off than we were in the past. Interestingly enough, you see a lot of people complain about crime, even though it's much better now than it has been before. In terms of war, so it kind of depends. I would say overall, for example, if you look at, there's this document from Our World in Data that looks at global deaths and conflicts since the year 1400. So this is kind of a 600-year history of violent conflicts in the world. And it feels like it's kind of been mostly steady. I don't know
if that's how you steady. Yeah.
You see a bit of a dip more recently in the past 50
Mm-hmm.
years or so. I think what brings up the average in the 20th century is the two world wars. Um,
Oh yeah. No, those
you know,
wars were ginormous. One and
and
is that graph total deaths or like deaths
it's
per
adjusted.
thousand?
It's
Okay.
adjusted. Yeah. So this is
Okay.
adjusted for
Because I
population.
one of the ones that you linked were not adjusted. It looked like, um,
Yeah.
which like makes World War II just like explode everything.
Yeah.
But once the Ukrainians are successful, there will never be human deaths. Only drone on drone combat.
So there's also another graph, and this is also from Our World in Data, but it looks at the total number of deaths. And this is not adjusted based off population, so maybe not the best um, tool or the best way of looking at it. But essentially, conflict. I mean, it really depends. I would say from 2001 to 2011, um, deaths from conflict were at all-time lows. And I think we've discussed this
Huh.
before. It's quite unexpected because that's when the
Oh
Iraq War
right,
was
and then
happening.
it changed from Syria, right?
Yeah. But if you look at
Yeah.
2022, the number of deaths was quite high, but it's still lower than it was in the 1970s, and that's with a larger population. And it's kind of mostly on par with what you saw in the 1980s, probably mostly because of the Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah.
But
Oh yeah.
I would say, overall, I would say one more thing I want to go to is there's this book called War Before Civilization, The Myth of the Peaceful Savage, and they basically look at the number of deaths related to.
Like
Um,
like even monkeys go to war with each other. Thanks, and everyone knows that now because of that one Netflix show.
but basically, they look at how much what was the rate of violent death in sort of um, prehistoric societies, and it was just really really high. So essentially, the lesson there is like, battle deaths and things like that were just it was a very, very big thing that happened in sort of ancient societies.
And that's actually something you can measure too, because you can tell if a skeleton was brutally murdered with a club or not.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would be
And
like, I don't think you can know that.
it's pretty easy to, obviously, it's pretty easy to see injuries on sort of skeletons, fossils, and things like that. So if we move over to health, so this is one area where I think like pretty much across the board, like we are much healthier than we were in the past. And this is interesting because a lot of people say the opposite. They say like, oh, Americans are as unhealthy as ever.
Well,
I
one
mean,
one thing I hear, which maybe we'll get into later, is a lot of people are like, with all the plastics and pollution, we're all just gonna die from cancer one day. Just expect that to happen.
that's a very that's a very sort of like just saying one day, bro. Like okay, like we'll see.
Are cancer rates up? But we are better
Age
at treating cancer. We're a lot better at treating it.
So a few things. So if you look at the infectious disease rate, so there's this paper, and this
Oh,
is
I
kind
saw a
of
Swiss cheese model up there.
so there's a paper, and this is from an unrelated article. It's milestones normal speech and language development across lifespan. So it's sort of a unrelated paper, but they did have a specific graph that I wanted to show. They look at the deaths by infectious disease from 1900 to 1996 in the United States, consolidated by J. Oller and S.D. Oller from two different CDC reports. So basically, deaths per 100,000 people from infectious disease. And infectious disease is a disease you can catch from someone else, bacterial, viral, etc. So the y-axis is not the best in this graph. Um, by the time you got to the 1950s, 60s, basically the rate of infectious disease death plummeted to, let's say less than 50 per 100,000. And a lot of this is because of sanitation. A lot of it is because of vaccinations, things like that. And in the old days, when you read about different historical figures, even very wealthy, powerful historical figures, people just constantly die from infectious diseases. Like Alexander the Great died probably from malaria when he was in his early 30s, for example. A lot of presidents, their children died at very young ages. And so, and even in the US, you had a lot of people getting things like yellow fever, and a lot of diseases that you associate with tropical areas, but they were quite common, even in the United States, back in the 18th century, for example. So I think we can definitively say we're better off in this area. I'm assuming you agree with that.
Yeah, I don't see much much room for argument.
So next we have Our World in Data, looking at cancer deaths, both crude and age standardized. So the older a population gets, the more cancer deaths there will be, just because of the higher age. So you kind of have to, because like older people are
That
more
does
likely
make
to
sense.
get cancer.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to adjust for age when you calculate this. So when you adjust for age, there was interestingly a slight increase from 1950 until 1990, like maybe
I
like
wonder
100.
What that was.
I think a lot of people just
smoking.
died. Yeah, I think people just died from other things first. Well, part of it's probably smoking. Yeah, I think it took a while for lung cancer to kind of manifest itself. But also, I think a lot of people just died before they got cancer from like heart attacks and stuff. So let's say it was about 140 cancer deaths per 100,000 people, and then it got up to maybe 150 something in 1990, and then it's been a steady drop since then. And
nice.
In 2020, in 2021, it was a little under 100 deaths. So cancer deaths are going down. It's undeniable. When you adjust for age, they're going down. And then next, when you look at health effects and metabolic risks in the United States from 1990 to 2019, so do you know anything about like metabolic risks, metabolic disease, anything like that?
No. What is a metabolic disease? Is that like?
So it's a lot of I don't know what the official definition is, but a lot of lifestyle related diseases that basically disrupt your metabolism. So a lot of things associated with obesity.
Okay.
Your diabetes. Yeah, diabetes.
Walrus man.
Yeah, and other things of that nature. Things that oftentimes are caused by obesity, by drinking too much, by smoking too much, etc. And if you look at age standardized death rates per 100,000 people for different things, metabolic risks, it's been going down steadily. High systolic blood pressure, it's been going down. High LDL cholesterol, it's been going down. And then others have been steady. So high BMI, high fasting plasma glucose, kidney dysfunction, etc. This is not to say that people have, lower cholesterol now, or that people are less obese now, because that's not true. People are more obese now. But what this does show is that doctors have become better at managing those diseases. So, for example, when it comes to blood pressure, we have blood pressure medication. For example, FDR for the last couple of years of his life had insanely high blood pressure, and the doctors just measured it, and they're like, well, we can't really do anything about it. He has high blood pressure. And now we can do something about it. Other than lifestyle changes, we can also give people medication. And also, now that Ozempic is coming out, I really think that's going to make a huge difference.
I was about to ask if we are at peak Ozempic, past it, or is it just getting started?
Well, there's a big thing about how much it costs. I think there's skyrocketing demand for Ozempic. It was originally for, what was it for? It was for something else. I think it was for like diabetes originally.
Yes, it was originally for diabetes, and there was an Acquired episode on it that I listened to, and they found that it was really, really good at weight loss because it basically just suppressed your appetite.
But yeah,
That's
think
basically what it is. It's an appetite suppressant.
Yeah, so some people might say like, oh well, why can't you just use your own willpower to, eat less. And it's just like, at the end of the day, whatever it takes, as long as it's, doesn't have adverse effects is I think a good
Yeah.
thing.
I think
And
we're in the
so
beginning of people actually using it that way, though. Like, I don't know how true this is, but I keep hearing whenever people talk about it now that you're on it, and then as soon as you stop taking it, you gain all the weight back.
I have heard that. I don't know if it's true. But
I've heard
overall,
it
I would
from
say,
two sources.
yeah, I would say I think the big reason, the reason people, there's a lot of causes of obesity, but generally speaking, it's when you eat more than you eat more, you consume more calories than you basically burn through your
Basically.
day-to-day life. So, part of that is people don't walk around that much because people drive everywhere. Part of it is, food is very calorie dense these days.
Put more
And the
sugar
reality
in
is,
it and
yeah,
stuff.
the reality
Yeah.
is most people just do not have the willpower to control, people. Part of it is cultural, in certain areas, people just eat unhealthy, and that's just kind of how things are.
Okay, circle jerk argument and fusion is the food industry is putting tons of sugar in all of our food, which is fattening, but they make it so it's more addictive and you have to buy more.
Well, I do think I I don't think so. The one thing I don't agree with is people who say that food companies purposely get people sick so that they can pass them off to like the drug industry. It's like, dude, like, do you really think two completely unrelated industries are like collaborating to that
Well,
degree?
I don't
Like,
think that's the circle jerk argument is that they make the food more addictive so that they can
well,
sell more
for sure
food.
they are. Of course they're doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely doing that.
Yeah, I
They're
don't think
they're
anyone's talking about like food industry doctor collusion.
they definitely try. The whole point of any industry is to get people to buy your product. And so, yeah, definitely they make food more addictive. Um, they make it addictive by putting sugar and fat in it, not by like putting cocaine in it or whatever.
Yeah.
And then,
Sugar and fat is delicious. Like, it's basically the same argument as, damn you, Netflix, for making so many great shows. Now all I can do with my time is watch Netflix.
so next we look at global health development. There's another Our World in Data website. In one part, they look at life expectancy. And the thing about life expectancy is it includes infant mortality. So when they say like, oh, life expectancy was like 30 back in the day, that doesn't mean the average person died it doesn't mean the median person died at 30. It means the average
No.
person died at 30, which means, a lot of babies that died. Um, but if you look at, until like the 19 like 30s, basically most parts of the world had. So I would say until the mid 1800s, the Americas and Europe had life expectancy of like around 35, and then that change happened later for other parts of the world. So in Asia, it kind of happened um, like maybe in the 1920s when life expectancy started going up from like 28 up to like now it's around 70 something. And then in Africa, probably the upswing probably happened in like the 1940s or 30s. And now it's, 60 something, which is still not as high as you'd hope, but much better than before. So people live, there's been a huge reduction in infant mortality over the past, century or so. And it, it's just, yeah, it says child mortality. In Sweden, child mortality in 1800 was almost 40%, and now it's close to zero. In India, it was over 40% as recently as the mid 1900s, or the early 1900s rather, and now it's 3%. So in the old days, like babies died all the time, which is unfortunate, and now that doesn't really happen to the same degree. So that's clearly a good thing when it comes to and then another big thing is maternal death. So back in the old days, like a lot of women died giving birth, in childbirth, they died. And that is just much, much smaller risk these days. So across the board, I think it's pretty clear that when you look at those types of metrics, that we're better off. And then finally, the percentage of people without any health insurance in the U.S. So this graph was showing basically back in it's from 1990 to 2022. So in 1990, only 86% of Americans had health insurance, and now it's 92%. So
that's a lot more.
Yeah, that's obviously that. So that's because of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. So when it comes to economics, there are several ways in which we're better off. So if we look at real median household income, so this is the median number, so it's not skewed by very high incomes, and it's inflation adjusted because it's real median household income. The definition of a household is just a group of people who live in the same house. So it could be parents with their children, or it could be like roommates, whatever. And real median household income has steadily been going up. So in the 1980s, in 1984, it was $58,930 in the U.S., and then it peaked in 2019 at $81,210. So much higher, and then it actually dropped in 2020, 21, 22 down to 77,540, and then in 2023 it jumped back up to 80,610. Point is, though, last year, 2023, real median income was still higher than it was in 2018. So it's objectively false to say that basically inflation is outpacing wages to such an extent that we're poorer than we were, I don't know, in like the mid 2010s or something. It's just not true.
There was a really misinformative graph that was circulating around. People were making fun of on Twitter. It basically, it was such a graph crime. It said it was labeled the state of economy. It said grocery prices up 21% since January 21st, and right next to it, it said average hourly wages were only up 3.8% compared to 21%, but it said since last September instead of since January 21st.
So it was using the wrong time.
Yeah, it had two different start times for the comparison. It's just like,
it also
bad.
You have to zoom out, when you look at these comparisons.
Yeah, because it's not a straight trajectory.
Well, because from 2019 to 2022, there was a steady drop in real median household income. That was because of inflation.
Oh, yeah,
that was because of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
But just go back if you move the graph from.
Well, inflation wouldn't have started till when we started coming out of COVID, though, wouldn't it? I thought inflation was really low before COVID.
Well, COVID happened in 2020.
Oh, I thought you said it started dropping in 2019.
Well, in 2020, it was lower than it was in 2019.
Oh.
So that this all happened because of COVID.
Okay. There's no data point in between 2019 and 2020. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, track it.
Yeah, this is year by year. Okay. But yes, from 2019 to 2022, real median income went down. But if you zoomed out just a little bit to 2018, then real median income for all of those years was higher than it was in 2018. So that just kind of adds some context when it comes to inflation, incomes, etc. Mm-hmm. If you look over the super long term, we're simply wealthier than we were in the past. Next, we look at real disposable personal income per capita. So this is not household income. This is personal income, and it's disposable income. So this is after taxes, I believe. And again, so this one you saw a spike in March of 21. I think that was because of stimulus payments and stuff. Right. And then it kind of drops back down. But the same pattern, if you look at 2018, for example, real disposable personal income is higher now than it was in 2018. So once again,
that's a really clear trend there.
And then if you look at spending on food, so if you go, there's this economic research service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it says budget share for total food. So in the 1960s, food was about in 1963 it was about 16% of your disposable personal income was spent on food, and then let's say around 2017, it was about maybe like 10.5%, and then you did see a jump up in 2021 to 2023, or 2021 to 2022. So it jumped from maybe 9% to maybe like 11.5%. But 11.5% is still higher than, or still lower than any point before 1993. So if you look all the way back to the 1960s, there's been a steady downward trend in terms of what percent of your money you spend on food. And if you look at food at home, it's been getting very, very cheap. Food away from home, so eating out, has been getting more expensive over time. Next, you look at household debt service payments as a percent of disposable personal income. So this includes both mortgage payments as well as consumer debt payments. And it's disposable personal income. So this is after taxes, I believe. But in 1980, basically around 10% of your income went to debt servicing, specifically, personal debt as well as mortgages. And then that reached a peak of around 15% around 2007. So that was right before the financial crisis, back when, you had the subprime loans, subprime mortgages.
Yeah.
And then there's been a steady decrease, and then a sharp drop during COVID with the stimulus payments, down to 9% in 2021. So the lowest in 40 years, basically. And then it's crept back up to like where it was right before COVID. It's at about 11%. So when you look at like how much debt people hold as a percentage of their disposable income, like it's not that high compared to historical trends. A lot of times you'll see articles online say like, Americans hold record debt. And I'm like, well, is that in absolute numbers, or is that as a percentage? Like you need to look at that context to understand what those numbers mean. And then next we look at household financial obligations as a percent of disposable personal income. And they recently stopped tracking this. But it's a broader measure than the debt service ratio we talked about. So this also includes rent payments, auto lease payments, homeowners insurance, property tax payments, etc. So it was around 15% in 1980, and then it got as high as 17%, and it's basically been in that band until 2007, where it was at 18%. Once again, there's been a deleveraging since then. On the eve of COVID, it was down to 14.6%, dropped as low as 12% in 2021, and now it's at around 14%. So historically speaking, household financial obligations are actually quite low as well.
Huh. Wow.
And then next we look at household debt to GDP for the US. So you compare, how much total household debt the country has, and then compare it to GDP. GDP is an annual measurement, so it's kind of comparing apples to oranges, whereas household debt is like a total amount of money you have on a balance sheet. So it's not a perfect comparison. But, it was 80. So debt was 85%. Household debt was around 86% of GDP in 2005, peaked at around 99% or 100% in 2007. And now it's at around 71%. So as a percentage of our GDP, we have much less household debt than we used to. If we look at the amount of money we spend on transportation, there's been a very small but noticeable decrease. So in 1999, we spent around 19% of our budget of our personal budgets on transportation, and now it's around 17%. So not a huge drop, but it is going down.
Wait,
and then next,
how are people spending that much on transportation? Wait,
well,
what is that a percentage of
your total household? It says average household expenditures percent of total household expenditures. So it's not okay. So I was wrong. It wasn't a percent of your income. It's a percent of the money you spent.
Okay.
So that takes out.
That's super flat, slightly lower, but super flat. Okay. Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be insane otherwise.
Yeah. And then, so that's economics. When we look at educational attainment, so we did an episode on education before, but in 1960, only 7.7% of Americans had college degrees, only 41% had high school degrees, and then now it's 91% high school degrees, 37.7% college degrees. Now, you could argue it's not always a good thing to have a degree if got an expensive degree that doesn't help you get a job. But all things considered, I think education is usually a good thing. So this also shows we're much more educated than we used to be. Next, if you look at global economic development, so if you look at global real GDP per capita, there's this paper, Population, Ecological Footprint, and the Sustainable Development Goals, by Partha Dasgupta and Aisha Dasgupta. So this is kind of not super related to what we're talking about, but there was an interesting graph basically looking at global real GDP per capita. And it was, basically less than 2,000 all the way until like the early 1900s, and now it's at like 16,000. So the globe as a whole is much wealthier than it used to be. In terms of civil society, I don't even have citations on these because they're kind of self-evident. But when it comes to minority rights, I think it's pretty obvious that we're much better across the board than we used to be. If you go far back enough in history, there was a period of time where the whole concept of protecting the rights of minority groups, it was like not even a thing people talked about.
Yeah.
Like if you go back to like ancient empires and stuff, like that very concept was like, for the most part, not even something people considered worth discussing.
No, I mean, those ancient empires were based on slavery.
Yeah, they would conquer a city and then they would kill off the men and enslave the women and children, and they're just like, "Yep, that's what we do." So yeah, I mean,
right,
things are not perfect when it comes to minority rights, but it's much better than it used to be.
Yeah.
When it comes to consumer protection regulations too, again, in the old days, like those didn't exist, and so they're not perfect, but they're much better than they used to be. And here's another one when it comes to lifestyle. So if you look at the number of international tourist arrivals worldwide from 1950 to 2023, when you look at the number of tourist travelers in the 1950s, it's a tiny fraction of what it is now. So I think these days it's, if you're middle class, I would say it's relatively normal to travel internationally on vacation. Especially college students. I think it's relatively common for college grad or recent college graduates or current college students to go on like, Europe backpacking trip and that type of thing. In the old days, like flights were too expensive. So most people never left the country. They never left their country.
Yeah, we had to get involved in war to do that.
Yeah. And then I don't have citations here, but when it comes to technology, I mean, when you look at climate control, communication devices, e-commerce, agriculture, refrigeration, time-saving devices like laundry machines, dishwashing machines, in those areas, life is just much more convenient now than it was in the past. So those are a few things to consider. Do you have any comments so far?
Well, actually, I see where we're going with this. One of my comments is coming right up. I was going to comment on, well, yes, once you average everything together, people are, on average better, but then someone say, oh, well, that's just because, the rich are getting way richer and then the poor are getting nowhere. So it's more about the inequality and equity, which is a loaded word depending on who you ask.
So next we're going to talk about areas where it's sort of mixed or nuanced. For example, there might be an area where things were, worse off in 100 years ago, but then they were really good 50 years ago and now they're bad again. Or areas where the data is not quite clear. So when you look at, so one is existential risk in terms of nuclear war. So if you look at, so obviously before, 1945 or whatever, there was no nuclear risk. There's this thing called the atomic clock or doomsday
Oh
clock.
wow, it's an actual
Um,
doomsday clock graph. I didn't. Of course, this exists.
yeah, so
We are looking
everyone's
at a how many minutes till midnight per year
yeah.
is the
Yeah,
graph we're
so
looking at.
it was like less than 2.5 minutes to midnight in the 1950s, and then it got up to almost 12% in the 1960s, got back down in the 80s, and then with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it got all the way up to like 17%, and that's been steadily going down again. It's hard to kind of really quantify this. I would say during the Cold War, like we had an insane number of nuclear weapons. We had like 10, I don't remember the exact number, but
We
it was like
had a
something like
lot. It was
it was like
crazy
10.
how much
Yeah,
we
it was like
had.
10 times. It was like 10 times more. I think it was like 10 times more than we have now. It was just like I think we had like 30,000 for the U.S. and 30 for the USSR. That might be wrong, but like and now it's like 3,000 each or something like that. We had so many more nuclear weapons. The difference now is more countries have nuclear weapons. So in the 90s, India and Pakistan both got nuclear weapons, and then in the 2000s, North Korea got nuclear weapons. So there's a broader set of countries that have nukes, even though the total number is much lower than it used to be. So are we better or worse off now than we were back in the day? It's really hard to say. So when it comes to economic areas where things are mixed, so one is inequality. So there's this article called Labor Unions in the U.S. Economy, and this is from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and it looks at both union membership rates as well as income share of the top 1% as basically a proxy to measure inequality. And so the reason I say this is mixed or nuanced is because things were bad in the past and then got better and then got worse again. So in the early 1900s, in 1917 to 37, union membership was roughly around 10 to 15% or so. And then in the mid 1940s, it got all the way up to 35% almost. And then it's been steadily dropping since then. And then when you look at inequality, so it was very high back in the day, in the early 1900s, from the 1910s and 1920s, top 1% share of income went up as high as around 22% in the 1920s, and then it dropped all the way down to almost 10% in the 1970s, and then now it's back up to around 19%. So it's a very true thing that inequality is getting worse in this country. It's absolutely true, but it was also bad in the early 1900s. When you look at
one thing that I've always wondered with inequality, though, is like it's one thing if the rich have like more money, but like can we apply an inequality calculation, but like in the form of a zero-sum game, or like correct it so it's not like assume that it's a zero-sum game?
well,
Does that
so
make
the
sense?
question is, yeah, it makes sense. Like for example, if let's say your income went from 100,000 to 110,000, but then your friend's income went from 100,000 to 200,000. You're both better off. Does it matter that your friend is much better off than you are?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, who cares at that point?
I think there's a lot of research that shows even if everybody's absolute wealth goes up, inequality still causes a lot of resentment. And a lot of
Well, yeah,
when you look at,
I mean, obviously, it would be resentment. Yeah.
and when you look at inequality correlating with things like crime and etc., that seems to hold even when the sort of average wealth of the country is higher. So something to kind of keep in mind.
I've never heard that argument before for some reason.
And when you look at global inequality, so there's a lot of different ways to measure it, but the Gini coefficient is sort of a well-known way of looking at it. So there's
You've
this
explained the Gini coefficient to me before. What is it again?
Yeah. So 0 is perfect equality, 1 is perfect inequality. I don't know how exactly they measure it. But there's this World Inequality Report from 2022, And in 1820, the Gini coefficient was 0.6, and then it got up to 0.772 from 1910 to 2000, and it's been going down since then. So there's actually been a steady worsening of inequality from the 1820s until I guess the 1910s. And then since then, it was mostly flat. And then starting in the 2000s, it's been getting better. And a lot of that, basically share of inequality when you're talking within country versus between country. And currently, it looks like about 70% of inequalities because of basically inequality within each country. So it's not so much that, the inequality between countries is getting worse. It's more that like inequality internal to countries is kind of bad across the board. Seems to be the lesson there. So it's a little nuanced, but not the best situation.
Well, and then everyone learned to not envy their neighbor like the Bible tells them to, inequality shouldn't be as much of an issue.
Yeah, we just got to tell people that.
God, they've been trying to tell people for like 3,000 years.
I think we should just tell them harder.
That's right.
So consumer debt service payments as a percentage of disposable personal income. So this is a slightly different measurement from the previous debt measurements. So this one's more flat. So back in like 1980, it was about 6% of disposable income went to debt service payments, and now it's about 5%. So I'm not completely sure. I guess the difference here is this is personal income rather than household income. So this might suggest that when you look at all people individually, it's a little different. So something else to consider versus households. And then when it comes to civil society, when it comes to a level of democracy, so things were getting, consistently better until, I guess, like the mid 2000s. So in the old days, let's say around 1944, 80% of countries were closed autocracies. 12%, and this is from Our World in Data. So 12% were elected autocracies, 2.7 were elected democracies, 4.73 were liberal democracies. So back in the World War II era, like the vast majority of human beings lived under, various forms of dictatorship. And then that got steadily better over time. I think part of that was decolonization. Part of that was, part of it was also, towards the end of the 90s, that was when the Soviet Union collapsed and all of the post-Soviet states, a lot of communist states became democracies. And then it kind of peaked in the mid 2010s, and then it's been getting slightly worse since then. So it's much better than it used to be, but it kind of turned, when you look at like the rate of change, it's actually started to get worse again. But it's still much better than it used to be. So something to consider. And then when it comes to technology and misinformation, so this is, hard to quantify. There's this article from MIT, and it says there's a study that says on Twitter, false news travels faster than true stories. Research project finds humans, not bots, are primarily responsible for spread of misleading information. So this research was done by, so the paper was called The Spread of True and False News Online. So there's a lot more. It's hard, the reason I put this in the sort of mixed category is because we also have more good information.
Very true.
In the old days, like a lot of people did not have, like a lot of people couldn't read. So they literally did not have access to the written word. All they knew was what other people told them. And if they lived in a society where there was like some sort of leader that controlled all the information, whether it was like a political leader or a cleric or whatever, a lot of people, really had almost no access to true knowledge. And that's gotten much better over the years. But I would say in the past 10 years, you're starting to see this flip side where you're starting to see a lot of misinformation. It's not the first time that's happened. There was yellow journalism at the turn of the 20th century. And also when the printing press first came out, there was a lot of like, pamphlets that were full of just nonsense
That
But
book
you're
I read, I think it
that
was
outreach
last year.
machine.
Yeah, that one does a really good history of it all.
Yeah. So that I put that in the sort of mixed category. And then happiness, this one I couldn't find a data on or any data on. So the happiness research is pretty clear that, basically like the Disney movies are right about like what makes people happy. It's basically like having good relationships with other people and having a sense of purpose, which sounds almost cliche, but that's basically what it takes. And there is research we'll talk about later where people have a lot less human connection. Do we have less of a sense of purpose? I know people are a lot less religious, and I know for a lot of people, religion gives them a sense of purpose. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any papers that really gave good answers on this question.
No, it's kind of hard to study. There was I can't remember if it was a hidden brain or something else, but someone well, the study where they were I think the conclusion was money will make you happy up until like a certain amount of money, then it makes no difference.
Right.
Well, they redid the study through it was like a redone adversarial study where they redid the methodology because I guess like the are you happy, are you not happy was like capping out because they were like asking it in like kind of a binary way. And it was like a mix between like for certain personalities, yes, like once you like obviously you're not going to be happy if you're like destitute and homeless and things like that. So there's like that kind of level, but like people that weren't workaholics that had more money did proportionately get happier for the more money that they had because they had where they were spending their money more effectively on happiness, while like some people would like have a lot of money but they weren't like spending it on themselves because they were like miserly or whatever.
Interesting.
Yeah, I gotta remember what podcast was going into it, but it was like rehashing that study that like so many people quote all the time.
All right. That was part one of our episode on whether we're better or worse off. Part two is coming up next.